It takes just a few moments to let everybody into the room. So just as we go through this bit, we'll just allow people to join us today. So yeah, there are people still joining, which is really good. We are not streaming live to Facebook tonight, but this recording will be available on our social media channels after the event. So while we're waiting, I'll just share a bit of housekeeping for those who are already on. At the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're on, you'll see a toolbar with a Q&A box. If you have any questions to ask or comments to make during the session, please make comments in the chat box and questions in the Q&A. We'll try and monitor both and make sure we don't miss any questions. There are a couple of us keeping an eye on it, but if you try and keep the questions in the Q&A box, it means we can make sure that they all are answered and they're in one place. So with numbers joined now, I think that we're ready to begin. So I'm just going to give some introductions so you know who that you are speaking with this evening. So I'm Jo Oakden. I'm currently the BV&A president, and alongside this I work as an RVN and practice manager in a small animal first opinion practice. I've been in practice for nearly 16 years now, and I'm also a clinical coach for 2 students currently. I also have 2 young children and I am navigating homeschooling with those children as well, so I definitely feel some of your pain going through that at the moment. I'm also joined tonight by the wonderful Nicky Ackerley, who heads up BV&A's member advisory service and is the owner of a HR support consultancy. Nicky has a BA Hons in business studies, is a member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and Nicky has been practicing HR for 20 years and has provided this service to the BV&A since it began in 2002. So she's very experienced to answer your questions. So welcome, Nicky. And also with me tonight, we have another Nicky, Nikki Ruedisueli. Nicky is our Head of Learning and Development and Editor-in-Chief of the VNJ here at the BV&A. Nicky is also an RVN and has been for a while. I'm not going to say how long because I think we wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Don't mention that.
Nicky joined the BV&A 15 months ago and she came to us from Nottingham Trent University where she ran the foundation degree there. So good evening, Nicky. Tonight's quite an informal session. We wanted to use it as an opportunity to go through your questions, queries, concerns. We're going to start with some questions that have been sent to us and just to start the chat and then we'll answer your questions after those. We might end up talking over each other. We'll try not to. I'll try and chair it so we get nice, concise answers. But as I said, it's a nice informal session just to have a chat and put minds at rest and hopefully get some of those concerns and queries answered for you. So please use the Q&A box and I hope you get sort of the support and answers that you feel that you need from tonight's session. So I'm going to kick off with the first question. So this question is probably more for Nicky Ackerley. And we'll start with one of the hot topics at the moment, Nicky. So it's been quite difficult keeping up with who is entitled to the furlough scheme. Can you give a brief overview of how it will work in the current lockdown?
Yes, I can, and I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
So for the current lockdown situation, people are entitled to be furloughed if they've been employed from the 30th of October. So that's the caveat for a lot of the answers, I'm sure, tonight, having had a look at some of the questions we're going to be asked, is who can be furloughed? And furlough is the right of the employer to put people onto furlough. We have dealt with a lot of calls from members who want to request furlough. You can request it, but it's not your right to ask for it. It is actually the practice's right or the employer's right to set up the furlough scheme through HMRC and nominate people that they can afford to have from the business onto furlough. And furlough's changed a little bit over the many months that we've been dealing with it now. And we have 2 types of furlough. We have furlough that is in blocks of a week, and we also have flexi furlough where you can flex somebody's hours for a day or part of a day. So if you need people in your practice and you're only working so many hours, you've reduced the hours, you're not doing a late shift, you're not doing weekends anymore, etc., and you're consolidating that, you can have people flexi furloughed and you might put them on a rota. So everybody, say, for example, does 2 or 3 days a week. We still have people that are shielding, and those people can either be on statutory sick pay, or if your employer pays company sick pay, the enhanced company sick pay. If you are sick for a non-COVID related issue, you would be on sick pay. So people that are shielding, or people who are furloughed that become sick because of COVID, can move on to SSP. Or if the employer wants to furlough those people shielding, they can. One of the hot topics at the moment, and I'm sure we're going to go on to more questions related to this, and certainly has been a very hot topic since the beginning of January, is about people that are homeschooling. Jo said she's homeschooling. I understand from many people it's very tricky. It's difficult to combine homeschooling and work and family life. And now we have the added conundrum that, can you be furloughed because your children aren't at school? You can, however, it is not a right to be furloughed whilst your children are at home. So it's something you can request, but it's really important people understand it's not right. And so if your employer requires you to be at work, you need to try and increase your support bubble for the purpose of childcare, and you're allowed one person to join your support bubble for that purpose only, and try and go to work where possible. So I keep hearing from people that Martin Lewis has said you can be furloughed. Can and must or will are quite different words. So it's really up to the employer. And I think, although you might not agree with your employer in all cases, they're trying to balance the act of keeping people employed, making sure the rotas are fair, making sure the people who are at work aren't overly tired and are able to perform their duties to the best of their ability. So we've got some people that have got childcare issues. We've got some people who are shielding. We've got some people who are sick with non-COVID related issues. We've got some people who are sick with COVID related issues. And we've got people who might be furloughed on a rota or in large blocks. And we've got some people who are expected to work. So that's not in a nutshell, but that's the premise at the moment to the way furlough is working.
Thank you, Nikki.
Okay.
I think that's cleared that up. I'm just going to hand over to the other Nikki for our next question.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've had a question in where a nurse isn't feeling that their practice is following the strict COVID rules with PPE and social distancing. So they were wondering who they would be able to contact about their concerns, and is there anything that they can do about that?
I think with all of these things, this is a really difficult time for employees and employers alike. The employers are trying to keep the business going. There's restrictions on how many people can come to the practice in the majority of practices. And the new processes in many practices of meeting people outdoors, taking their animal from them, is causing all sorts of conundrums for all sorts of people, not least clients, and everyone's trying to keep the businesses afloat. So I think in the first instance, my recommendation would be that you ask for a risk assessment. Under the Health and Safety at Work Act, that covers all sorts of issues to do with the workplace, not least this situation. And so there should be a risk assessment, and you might be familiar with them in your practice because of X-ray equipment, because of anaesthetics, because of pregnancies, where risk assessments have taken place. You can go to the Health and Safety Executive website and find a risk assessment. It's free, and then you just modify it for your own workplace. So my recommendation would be, in the very first instance, you carry out a risk assessment. That will be familiar to many of you. And you ask the practice manager or the director, clinical director, or a senior member of staff, might be the owner, to go through that risk assessment with you. So you're assessing the risks if they're not requiring people to wear PPE, if they've got too many people trying to work socially distanced in one particular office. So I remember from first lockdown, there was one practice, they had 6 pregnant nurses who they were trying to socially distance, but they were all in one office, and the office was only really big enough for 3 people. So some of those people ended up working from home, and they were able to modify the work pattern to accommodate everybody. And I think that's really an important step forward, is firstly, do that risk assessment. If you absolutely feel after that you're not getting anywhere with your local management, then what I would do is raise it within the organisation to a higher authority. And I would only recommend if at this point you've exhausted the internal process, you could contact the health and safety executive, you can contact the BVA, you certainly can contact us, but we have no authority over the rest of the organisation. We don't have any authority at all. We're just giving advice. But I would try and resolve it in-house using the risk assessment in the first instance.
Thank you, Nikki. I think we've all had experience of many, many risk assessments throughout this past nearly year now. I've certainly been up to my eyeballs in them, but they are really important to make sure that you're working in a safe environment and you can carry them out yourselves. And it gives you evidence then to your boss. So I think that's a really good suggestion. So the next question I've got is, if I have to self-isolate, but I'm not positive for COVID, my practice won't pay my salary. How do I go about claiming benefits during this time, and how long will it take for the money to come through?
So I think the situation has improved from where we were last April. If you're entitled to universal credit, you can apply for a grant, and there is a one-off £500 payment that the government are offering, and you can claim that through universal credit. There was a big time lag, sort of 8 or 10 weeks, which didn't help in many circumstances. In the previous long lockdown, that has vastly improved. The systems have all improved. People have got smarter at this now. So that's the route to go. And if you think you're going to need that, put in for it as soon as possible.
Thank you. That was the next part of my question. What is the £500 payment the government are offering, and can I claim it? So where would we go if we needed to look at that? What is it? Is it something we can look at online, or who would we contact?
There's a government website, and you need to just Google government universal credit, and it will take you to the page.
Thank you, Nikki. So I'll hand over to other Nikki for.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So another question that we've had is the fact that a practice has said to their staff that they had a loss of income during the first lockdown, and they're not really sure that they're going to survive this one. So this is an independent practice, and what staff are worried about is whether their jobs are on the line. So can a practice just fire you or make you redundant due to these circumstances?
When the Coronavirus Act was written in March 2020, it was one of the fastest pieces of legislation that's ever been written. And as with a lot of employment legislation, it's governed by custom and practice. So let's just forget COVID for a moment. In organisations that find themselves in difficulty, there is very strict legislation under the Employment Rights Act, which covers things like dismissals and redundancies. And frankly, we could talk about that all night. And previously, we did run a webinar on redundancies and what it involves. So I'll keep this as brief as I can. If you have 2 years service, you have the right in this country to claim unfair dismissal. You have the right to claim a detriment or dismissal by reason of equality if the redundancy or the dismissal is related to race, sex, gender, etc. So that falls under the Equality Act. So you could have somebody claiming a detriment, let's say they weren't offered the job because they were pregnant, then that is potentially discrimination. And people don't need 2 years employment to claim that. So if ever your employer says, you know, you're pregnant, you're have a different religious background, etc., and therefore I'm not offering you the job, or you're the first person I'm going to sack, then that is unlawful. For the vast majority of people that aren't covered by the Equality Act, they're covered by the Employment Rights Act. Once you have 2 years service, you have a lot more protection under the law than you do prior to 2 years service. Anybody that has 2 years service has the right to claim redundancy, or the right to be paid redundancy pay. Sorry, correct myself there. You don't claim it, you're paid it. If your employer feels that the circumstances are such that they've made a loss and they can't see the way forward, then they have the right to go through a redundancy process. That's a very strict process, and it involves consultation with staff. If there are more than 20 staff to be made redundant, they have to consult for 30 days. If there are less than 20 staff, they have to do reasonable consultation. That is usually between 5 and 10 days, let's say for a group of 8 people. Now, it's the final number that determines how long we're going to consult for, not the number of people that are put in what is called the selection pool. So we have this pool, let's say it's all the vet nurses, but not the practice manager. So let's say all the vet nurses are in a pool, and they can then be scored against selection criteria of what the employer thinks they need for the business going forward. So they might decide that they're going to focus on particular generalist skills, and they might list all of the skills that you've got in the practice and score them all out of 10 points. And it will be the people that with a lower score, so perhaps the less experienced, who would fall at the bottom of the list of people in the pool, and it would be those people that could be made redundant. If you are made redundant, you would be paid your notice pay. You might be required to work your notice, or you could be paid it. And if you have the 2 years service, you would receive potentially some redundancy pay. And that is 1.5 weeks redundancy pay for every completed year's service over the age of 40 and 1 week under the age of 40. And that's how we calculate that. But there is a really strict process. We do have some fact sheets on that, but that process must be followed. What the practice couldn't lawfully do is walk in tomorrow and say, you and you're redundant, with absolutely no consultation. And if that was to happen, then there is something called a protected act, which means that the people who suffer a detriment, the people that are made redundant without that process, could be paid up to 90 days compensation for the law not being followed. And in this case, around redundancy, the law is all about this consultation, letting people know what's happening, letting them understand the reason why, looking at alternatives, perhaps job sharing for a while. Some people might want to work part-time. Somebody might be just about to go on maternity leave, so that might create an opportunity for somebody else. So it's all about process under the redundancy. And it is quite a hefty piece of legislation, but it covers everybody with 2 years service in this country, and perhaps some of those people that have claims, as I said earlier, for the equality issues. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that, Nikki. Because what I will say is that we're going to share a link with a webinar that actually Nikki did for us back in April. So what we'll be doing with our delegates is sharing the link on the webinar on redundancy, and that goes into much more detail. So as you'll see from that webinar, we can do a whole evening on redundancy.
Yeah.
So thank you for summarising that, Nikki. Well done with that one. So another thing that people are worried about is the fact that actually when they've been furloughed in the first lockdown and they've come back, and during that furlough, obviously a lot of procedures have changed within the practice, and sometimes it's quite difficult to integrate back into the team. And I know a few people are just worried about how they can manage this situation, other ways around it, and what can they do, because it has been challenging for them.
I think one of the things that's been introduced in recent years that's helped to integrate people when they've had periods of absence from work is kit days when you've been on maternity leave. So you have these keeping in touch days. So people can ease back in, perhaps do a day a week and find out what's been happening, who the new people are, etc. Now, I'm not suggesting that somebody will have been off furloughed for 12 months, and I sincerely hope that is not the case. But I think a mini kit day return, so any sort of return to work after absence, it could be maternity leave, it could be after a period of illness, it might be that somebody's had a bereavement, any sort of reintroduction back to the workplace. And you probably have inductions for new staff. I think just refresh people with that. Those return to works, those inductions, reintroduction to new protocols, people do feel it a bit like a fish out of water because they don't know what's happening with the kitchen facilities. You know, how many people can be in an office at the same time? How many people can be in reception? How do you do the rota for the reception staff, letting people come to pay, that sort of thing? Who's manning the phones? So there's a lot of changes within the workplace. It's not all about nursing. And lots of nurses will be now doing a lot more consults on the phone, taking repeat meds, etc. So I think it's about write these protocols as if they were for a new person joining you, like a mini induction of the return to work. And I think that will help people integrate much more quickly. Maybe a buddy system to help them.
That's a really good idea, actually. It is almost, isn't it, as reintegrating people into, and it's a new starter almost. So yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you for that.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to one of the questions that's come in via email from one of our members, just to get your take on this. So I was wondering if you knew where we would stand with regards to moving around branches during the pandemic. It is in our contract that we are expected to work at any of our branches when needed. Obviously, in normal circumstances, this would be absolutely fine, but many of us have been asked to move from our usual branch to cover another branch that has been hit with COVID. Understandably, many of us feel uncomfortable with this, but when questioning management about the mixing of people between branches, we've been threatened with a disciplinary or legal action due to breach of contract. So how would you deal with this situation in practice?
Well, let's start where you just stopped, which is the breach of contract. If your contract says that you are supposed to be flexible and move to other branches, then really you need to try and accommodate that, however difficult that is. And to go back to one of the questions we answered earlier, I think it's really important that you do the risk assessment. So if people are travelling and mixing amongst different branches, that we make sure the PPE protocols, the risk assessments, etc., are correct for each of the branches. If there was a COVID outbreak, I would try and investigate where that came from and where that breach of the COVID protocols came, if it did come from work, and improve the cleaning, the use of gloves, face masks, etc., and perhaps have some deep cleaning at that facility just to give everybody a little bit more confidence. So do that. You are obliged to fulfill the contract that you've signed. So it's really important that you try and put across your point of view about what are your reluctances about transferring to the other branch, but legally you would be on a bit of a sticky wicket if you carte blanche refuse to do it. One of the things that I've seen in a number of different businesses and industries is people working in bubbles together, so that an organisation or practice is not dependent on everybody doing different shifts and doing different rotas and coming into contact with everybody, but keeping bubbles that are working closely together and not doing too much integration outside of the bubbles. So it's just similar to your family bubble. Keep it as simple as possible with a mix of skills that constantly work together. And then you reduce that cross-contamination. For the people that are moving across the branch, I would definitely ask for risk assessment if you're asked to go to a branch you're not usually at. I would definitely ask for that induction that we just talked about. So what are the protocols in different places? There might be, you know, different kitchen facilities. They might take payment in a different way. They might have different toilet facilities, etc. So understand what the rules are at the new branch. Make sure people are not travelling together to work, etc. But it is really important that you follow this lawful instruction, which comes from the root of your contract. So if it's a lawful instruction that you move branches, then please make sure that you have very good reason for not doing that. And that you put, if necessary, the ultimate would be to raise a grievance, and you'll probably have a grievance procedure. And if you don't, we can provide you with one that complies with the ACAS guidance. And you could raise a grievance. So instead of just not doing what you've been asked to do, you've actually put it into writing about why you object to it. Don't just walk away. Actually discuss it. Actually put your case together, and maybe some of those things can be answered.
Thank you, Nikki. It is a lot of it is about communication at the moment, isn't it? And expressing those concerns and those worries so that the employer has the opportunity to negotiate that and put things into place so that people feel secure and safe. It's definitely an issue that I've heard other nurses going through and have those concerns with as well, but it is a contractual obligation. So communication is key with this one.
And I think, if I can just add to that, you know, we're all in this together. Everybody who's qualified in the veterinary profession wants to be able to work. They want to be able to fulfill their professional obligations. Nobody wants to down tools and say, oh, I don't want to do that, but everybody needs to feel safe. And every profession, every walk of life, every employer has got a duty of care to their employees. And we hope all of these veterinary practices will continue to exist and flourish in the future because they employ so many veterinary nurses, practice managers, advisors, etc. So we want it to be successful for everybody and keep people safe.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions that have come through, and they kind of relate around a similar subject. So I was going to lead on the answering these questions because I've been dealing with it directly recently and being in practice as well. But please chip in, Nikki and Nikki, if you feel you have something that you feel is relevant and needs to be added to this. So the first question that we've had through is in the Q&A box is, in the current lockdown, what veterinary work is permitted to go ahead? My practice is still going ahead with routine neutering appointments and boosters. So to start with, I'm just going to read you a direct quote from the RCVS, and then I'll expand on that afterwards. So it says that RCVS and BVA guidance allows for non-emergency work that is essential for animal health and welfare now or in the time frame of lockdown to continue, but there is no obligation that this work must be carried out. So this is allowing flexibility in practice, entirely dependent on what the practice can do, their staff can do, their capacity. And it's really important to look at it from that point of view. We are required by the RCVS to provide a 24-hour service, but that doesn't have to be in our practice. So a lot of us outsource our 24-hour care to another practice overnight anyway. So it's just making sure that we have good relationships with the other practices. If you have a practice that has staff working in safe teams that are happy coming in and working in those conditions, that don't have any childcare issues and there are no pressures, and you can carry out neutering and vaccinations safely, there is no reason that you can't carry out those procedures. There are some practices that have less of the urgent emergencies, long-term sick cases that can carry out these procedures. And you can very easily argue that in the long term, they are relevant to animal welfare. I think most of us, especially in first opinion practices, are feeling the backlog still of the postponed vaccinations from the last lockdown. And we're getting to the point where those vaccinations are overdue and courses have had to restart. And there have started to be parvo outbreaks, for example. There are also issues with cats and neutering, the unwanted pregnancies, and all of the issues that come with that. So we can very easily argue that vaccinations and neutering in some cases are quite important and can be carried out during this lockdown. But it's been left to individual practice decision, and it has to be based on the team's comfort in carrying out those procedures and the practice's capacity. I discussed with my team what they were happy carrying out, what they were happy having in, and how we could accommodate that in practice while keeping ourselves and our clients safe, but then not putting extra pressure on ourselves that we really don't need again after the lockdown when it ends. We also don't 100% know when this lockdown is going to end. We've got a time frame of half term, but if it gets rolled over again, we don't want to have to keep postponing those things that then do start to become urgent and put pressure on. So I would say that it's entirely practice dependent, your capacity, speak to your team, speak to your management and make those decisions together about what you can safely provide during this time. Does anybody else have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's about right, isn't it? It's what they're trying to do is let the practices take charge a little bit of working out what they can offer and the facilities that they've got. So I think it is sort of down to the practice, but you're right that it's important that everybody should talk together and make sure that you are all comfortable with the situation and what is happening, because you do need to think long term. So is this going to make problems worse in the future? So
yeah. And there's a lot of pressure on us at the moment to make those decisions. And it's not only within our teams, the pressure from the public is really huge at the moment. The demand on our services is big, and it has been since the end of the first lockdown. So we've just got to take that into account as well and just make sure that we can cope in that capacity. So another question, which is a very contentious issue at the moment. If anybody's been in any of the social media forums, it's getting quite heated. There's a lot of worry, concern, stress, which is all completely understandable around the key worker status. So another question there is, do we have any information on whether VNs will be classed as key workers at some point? I'm unable to start my new employment as I'm not classed as a key worker, so my daughter cannot go to school. This is really hard, and don't think that the associations and our regulatory body haven't been lobbying for VNs and vets to get key worker status. This has been going on since even last year when it first happened. And last year, emergency vets were recognised as key workers, but it never expanded to RVNs. In this year, even emergency vets are not classed as key workers because there is the thought process that there are enough of us in the profession that don't require that key worker childcare to be able to provide a basic level emergency service. Now, this is a really tough thing to have to deal with, and I really do understand people's pressures and strains. Like I've said before, I've got 2 young children, and we are in a fortunate position where I'm able to try and be flexible. And I can do some work from home, but I realise that some of our RVNs really can't do that. I would say at the moment, it's looking exceptionally unlikely that VNs will be classed as key workers in the near future. The first stage would be our emergency care vets, and they're not on that status at the moment. Now, just to reiterate, this is just in England. The guidance differs between Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So please read the individual guidance and support on those pages as well. Wales, for example, will accept RVNs as key workers. But I think the important thing to remember is the reason this has occurred is because the pandemic is worsening. We've been lobbying for this position, but it's been denied because the pandemic is worsening. The pressure on the schools is huge. If any of you have had letters of communication from your schools, some of them I've heard reports have been up to 70% capacity with the demand. And this is causing the government to crack down and schools to crack down on key workers. And there are schools that are requiring that both parents are key workers with documented evidence of rota clashes that those children have to be in school. And that's a really sort of severe instance, but it's not just us in that situation. There are people who are a key worker who are being rejected for these places because they've got another parent at home or in another job that could potentially provide this service. So while it is really hard, and I really understand people's frustrations, and I wish I could say that every RVN is going to be granted key worker status so it isn't a problem, it's not something that is going to be solved in the near future. So we really need to be open and discuss with our employers about the options that are available to us. And I would really hope, and there is definitely guidance coming from the corporates now, that they really need to support their staff in these positions and try and be flexible to offer either situations where they can carry out work from home. It may be that some of us have to use a bit of holiday. There may be some flexible things that we need to, we need to bend, both of us. We both need to make a change to try and accommodate this so that we can all get through it. So I really do understand people's pain, but with regards to whether we are going to get key worker status in the near future, just it's highly unlikely. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add on that?
I can just add that we've had a lot of calls about this, as you can imagine, a huge amount, and there is no right to be furloughed if your employer is expecting you to go to work. So look at flexible working, as Joe says, look at holidays, ensure that you can get the right support and add that support bubble, which you are allowed to do, and perhaps reduce hours, even consider sharing childcare responsibilities with perhaps a co-worker so that you can support each other and perhaps split your shifts accordingly.
Thank you. Yeah, it all goes back to communication again, which I think is key of a lot of the things that we've discussed in our questions today. Just being open with your team and realising that there are a lot of people kind of in this situation as well, and maybe speaking to friends or colleagues in different practices to see how they're working around it as well. And, you know, our advisory service is there to provide advice as well, but it does all come back to us really needing to sort of drive that change and responsibility and communication with our practices to try and get the support we need. We also need to remember that support bubbles this time are in operation, and they weren't in the first lockdown, so we can have a support bubble for childcare. I know that's not appropriate in every situation, but it is a little lifeline there, if somebody has that support available. So moving on from key workers, because that is a subject that could be discussed for a really long time, and it's not going to change anytime soon. I've just got a question here from email that was from a student nurse, so this is probably relevant to you, Nikki. So it says a question from email is that I'm currently studying as a first year block release SVN with the College of Animal Welfare, and due to current lockdown I've had my placement postponed. There are a number of my cohort in the same situation, and the college have advised that due to this, they plan to submit an exceptional case to the RCVS to allow us to qualify in 2022 with less hours than the required 2,990. Are you aware whether the RCVS are accepting exceptional cases and whether they have indicated they will accept these exceptions for SVNs completing their courses up to 2023?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And what I will say is that we're having a specific student webinar next week, next Wednesday, and we'll be addressing questions like this. And Julie Dugmore from the RCVS will be attending that to answer these questions for you. Now, what I would say is that at the moment, the answer to this question is still that they will look at each case as exceptional circumstances. And I have to say that the RCVS are there to support you as well. They want to make sure that we're getting nurses onto the register. They're wanting to make sure that we do get nurses onto the register. And we know that some students have found it really difficult through this prolonged training period. So the RCVS will be fair about this and they will look at it. But as far as a blanket exceptional circumstances, I don't know that at this moment in time, but this is certainly a question that we will put towards Julie next week when we have the student specific webinar. So I haven't really answered the question, but I'm hoping I can tease you enough so that we can have the question answered next week if you attend the webinar. And we'll put it on the forum as well for you as well, because I know a lot of students are worrying about that. And we've had quite a few contacts from students worrying about what's happening with their end of point assessments, what's happening with their time in placement. So hopefully if you can attend next week, or if you can't attend, at least send us the questions and we can pose these questions to the panel that we're going to have on there for you.
Thank you, Nikki. Students have certainly been a very hot topic for us, haven't they, recently? And I know that you have actually taken time out to speak individually to support people as well that have run in with queries and concerns. So this student webinar is next Wednesday on the 20th, and it will be sort of shared and advertised on our social media as well as our website. And it will be hosted by Nikki and Sam, and they'll have Sam Morgan, and they'll have some other guests as well to hopefully answer all of your queries and concerns and help you sort of deal with the situation that the students have really been facing since March last year. And as Nikki's pointed out, it's got a little bit better. There are some things in place, but it is still a worry and a concern for those who are training and working hard to join the profession. So thank you for that, Nikki. I haven't heard any further questions come in, so I'm going to use this opportunity to round up this webinar now. I would just like to reiterate that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared on our forums and social media so that people have access to look at it. Nicky Ackerley at BMAS is available there for all of our members if you have any worries. I know that there are some up-to-date fact sheets on furlough. I'm just going to pass over to Nikki to round up from the advisory service.
Thanks, Jo. One of the questions that we haven't been asked this evening, and I'd just like to touch on it, is track and trace. So we've had a lot of questions from practices where they've asked their staff to turn off the QR code. The QR code is not a requirement for the employment environment, so you don't have to have a QR code. And if Track and Trace did contact you, then it's because they have good reason to do that. It's not because everybody was in Marks and Spencer's on Saturday and somebody had coronavirus. You've got to have been with somebody without PPE for 15 minutes, or with PPE for 15 minutes and 5 minutes without the PPE. So you can talk to somebody in the street for a couple of minutes without your mask on, as long as you've got some social distance. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody you've passed in the street or in the supermarket, you're going to be put onto the Track and Trace list. Now, we've had some situations over the last week where practice has had somebody that's been tested positive, but they didn't meet everybody else in the practice. So not everybody is being asked to isolate, but we certainly have seen an increase in the number of people isolating. So this social distancing, the wearing of masks, you need to really ramp that up if you've let it become a little bit lax. And these social bubbles, support bubbles, work bubbles are really important so that you know who you've worked with. Because that's what Track and Trace want to know. Once Track and Trace contact you, they will send you either a text from NHS Trace. It's called NHS in capitals Trace without a gap. That's the official text facility, or it's an 0300 number that will call you. Anything else is not legit. And it will be followed up with a letter, and you do have a reference number on that letter, and your employer will be asked to, you'll be asked to provide your employer with that document that says you're being told to isolate. If at any point the employer wants to breach that isolation notice, then that is a serious issue. I have not come across so far, thankfully, anybody in the veterinary profession that's asked anybody to do that. I have come across it in other walks of life. But that letter is the letter that informs that you must isolate, and it will say the dates that you've got to isolate on it. So I just wanted to add that about track and trace. It isn't a one size fits all. The track and tracers are looking at the individual circumstances. The only other thing I would say is, you know, we are here. We are trying to support people through what is a very difficult time. And I'd like to thank the panel for inviting me this evening.
Thank you, Nikki. I'd like to share a huge thank you to Nicky Ackerley and Nikki Ruedisueli. Have been working really hard, especially behind the scenes as well, to make sure that all that information is there and that support is there to try and help everybody through this. As has been mentioned this evening, we are all in this together. We're all facing different challenges, but we are all dealing with it in our own way in these different challenges as well. Hopefully this sort of chat has gone along some of the way to give you some of the guidance you need to help tackle some of the issues that you've come up against in practice. Again, there will always be an ability to ask questions to us, and we can try and answer those for you as well, either via BMS or via the BVNA service. So please do get in touch if you have any worries or concerns. This webinar will be shared on our socials forums, as I said earlier, so you can rewatch it again. And I'd just like to mention again the next 2 webinars that we have coming up over the next 2 weeks to try and support everybody through this time. We've got our students next week on the 20th at 7:30 p.m. again. And then on Thursday, the 26th, we've got a wellbeing and feel-good webinar session, and that will be with Katie Ford and Lisa Quigley, hosted by myself. So some ways there to tackle everything that we're going through and help us all feel a little bit more uplifted and in charge of our own well-being as well. So I hope that some of you will be able to join us for both of those sessions. Particularly the student one, if you have students in practice who are currently worried, or you're a student yourself who are worried about the things that we're facing at the moment. So please do join us to these. So I want to give a huge thank you again to Nikki and Nikki for joining us tonight, and I hope everybody else has a nice evening and manages to get some rest. And we will see you next week on Wednesday. Take care. Thank you. Bye.